Hello, how you doing?
Hey, friend, good. Doing all the same things over here, multitasking, getting the space tweeted out, but I'm all set and ready to go. And look, you were here right on the dot. You weren't even running late, so that was awesome.
Yes, it worked out.
So
Oops, I forgot that it was also forgot that I was also on my desktop.
I did the same thing. I think that might have been my sound coming through too. So I, I quickly muted that also.
Oopsies.
How has your day been? Sounds busy.
It worked out. I thought I was gonna have a conference call right before this, but it ended up getting rescheduled, so I had a little free time. I'm so happy that tomorrow's Friday, I must say.
Yeah, you had a busy week with shipments coming in. How regularly does that happen for you?
We usually ship orders Mondays and Fridays. So, depending on how busy it's been throughout the week and what accumulates, like I think since Monday, it's been a slower week. Like maybe I have 6 or 7 packages I have to go drop off tomorrow. But yeah, it's a regular thing. I'm always seeing my post office guy. His name is Greg, Mr. Greg.
I love that. I haven't been active with it, but I used to be pretty active with a t-shirt company, like a mini print shop that I set up out of the home. I'm trying to think of what year I did that. I used to homeschool our oldest who has autism, and I really created it as a way to like help him connect with math in a practical way. So we created a little t-shirt company. And then of course, he didn't want much to do with it after we started it. But I maintained it. But yeah, I started shipping things out of my home and the nearby post office and stuff. So it can be really fun. But you are so on the ball with it. I have to say, I'm always in awe of all that you do and accomplish, and in such um I don't want to say regimented, but you're very reliable and very what's the word I'm looking for? Quick. That's not right though, but anyway, I admire it and look up to it. So you've got it going on for sure. Welcome to let's see, Exodus. Good to see you, fellow Elevate friend. And Katisha, I first time meeting you, but maybe you know Miss Sierra here. Welcome to the room. And yeah, we can start whenever you want to. I'm just kind of rambling at this point. I think I'm a little full of caffeine.
It is all good. I am so excited. Today is our second episode of our weekly Twitter space, our mindful business Twitter space that we're hosting in conjunction with our friends at Elevate, who have an awesome profile picture collection of these amazing octopuses. Which one is it, Abby? Is it both? Is it whatever I feel, or is there a right word for multiple octopus? I don't know.
So honestly, you'll find sources that will support both. Most sources I've come across, I was convinced the octopuses is the correct way because I was really trying to find the right answer to this. But the more I dig and the more I research, it seems to be either is correct. I know they're cephalopods. We can't mess that up, but
Yeah, octopuses just has a weird vibe and ring to it, but I guess the more times you say it, the more normal it sounds. Hey, crypto yogi, welcome. I think at this point I've shared the space across all the accounts, so I'm sure over the next, 15, 20 minutes, people will start to fill the room and we'll have a few more people listening with us. But I think in the meantime, since we're trying to kind of stay within an hour, might as well get started. I'm so excited to talk about boundaries. I sent an audio message to Abby earlier and was mentioning I'm like a recovering people pleaser, which I'm sure I'm sure some of the people who join and listen to this space can relate, and that might be why you're tuning in. Either you're looking to learn to set boundaries, or you're kind of struggling to protect your energy from others. So that being said, I'm really excited to talk about boundaries. It's something that's near and dear to my heart, and there's so many ways we can attack this, Abby. What's at the front of your mind in terms of like what's immediately popping into your head when I say create boundaries? Like what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, when you left that voice memo earlier, I had to laugh. Once upon a time, I have to think really far back to being able to relate to the people pleasing thing. But yeah, I probably kind of shifted out of that early on in my 20s, but it was really motherhood that helped me solidify out of necessity that I had to get better at creating boundaries, or you just burn out, right? I think it's something to be said to think about all the reasons why it's important to set boundaries. I think people talk about it, but like really unpacking not just what it looks like, but why we need to do it and what we avoid when we do that. And I know just from personal experience, there's just one human body here in this lifetime that I've got. And so, and I'd love to have 10 arms like Durga, but I don't. And so, it has served me well in my 46 years to figure out along the way to be clear about communicating those things so that I don't burn out and so that I can do all the things more gracefully and in a less cranky way, honestly. What are your immediate thoughts when you think about this conversation, Sierra?
I am so glad that we have like different lives. And by that, I just mean like I'm turning 30, you're in your mid 40s, you have multiple children, I have no children. So I feel like we're like covering the gambit of womanhood here. And I think that's awesome and beautiful and like highly necessary. So I love that. I guess what pops into my head first is like the signs that you need boundaries. Like what the first thing that pops into my head is like, how do I know that I need to establish a boundary? How do I know that a boundary is being encroached upon? How do I know that I haven't done a good job setting boundaries? And for me, that usually feels like burnout. It usually feels like a low level of resentment. It usually feels like being overwhelmed or like really starting to recognize I've been neglecting my self care. Starts to feel like I don't have any time for myself. So I'm curious, Abby, like, what are the red flags that come up for you and make you realize, like, make an alarm go off on your head, like, boundary is necessary, like, time to think about boundaries?
Well, first, I totally agree with and appreciate the same thing that we have so many things in common, and yet we are in these different places in our lives a little bit. And so I love that we can bring such unique perspective and have something to really talk about and dig in. So I love that. And yes, similarly, I know my body very well because I've excuse me, because most of my mindful practices, I would say in the last, I don't know, 23, 24 years have been really centered around body work or yoga or these things. It's helped me to tune into the sensations in my body. So I know if things are starting to shift a little bit. I might not get the memo until after someone gives me that look like, hey, cranky. Oh, right. Maybe I am a little on edge today. Or if I start to feel tired, because I have a really, really pretty regular sleep schedule. That's one of my own personal boundaries I've tried to maintain. And so if I don't feel rested, I know that's one of my red flags that okay, somewhere I'm depleted in my life. So those are definitely red flags. Like you said, that burnout and resentment is a huge. And that's I feel like when resentment comes, it's like okay, we missed those, that's definitely the red flag. Maybe we've missed the warning flag on the way to the red flag. And when resentment starts to set in, I know that somewhere there's been a breakdown of boundaries along the way for sure. I appreciate that you brought that up.
Oh my goodness. Sleep. I love that you mentioned sleep. I'm also big on like having a hard cutoff in terms of my accessibility and like certain hours where I know I need to rest and like not look at my phone or answer calls or watch TV or whatever. Yes, creating boundaries around rest and sleep is so important. And I feel like now is a perfect time, one, to welcome some of the people in the room. So, welcome Jody. I see Jody's here. I see Connor is here. I see Crystal is here, who recently bought some crystals from our store. So, welcome. Nice to have you. And the second thing I want to mention is like, we're talking about boundaries, but for those of you who are unfamiliar with the topic of boundaries, boundaries are how we communicate to other people, like what's acceptable and what's unacceptable in our relationship with them. And boundaries really help us kind of create a parameter to know what to expect in our relationships with people. They help us communicate our needs, they help us create more clarity, they help us define our roles in our relationships. Um, I personally grew up in a family that operated on a lot of unspoken boundaries. And that kind of led into me having to learn this skill independently as an adult. And by that, I mean, it was always kind of implied in the house that I grew up in what was okay and what wasn't. And people never really explicitly said, what bothered them or what made them feel good, and kind of just would dance around it or be reactive, and kind of you'd figure it out based on their reaction. Like there'd been so many scenarios I can just remember where it would have been appropriate for one of my parents to set a boundary with me, but instead I was either like reprimanded or or something like that, and it kind of just didn't help the situation because I didn't realize I was crossing a boundary with them. And something I've realized as well is full transparency. I grew up in a household where one of my parents had an addiction issue. My father was a big drinker for most of my life, and God bless him, within this last 5 to 7 years, he's given up alcohol and is now sober. So I'm really proud and happy about that. But that being said, if you're a child growing up in a household with a parent with addiction issues, that also the kind of experiences you have in your home around boundaries, because often parents with addiction issues will kind of send the message to their children that their boundaries aren't as important as the parent's addiction. And they won't explicitly say that, but it becomes very clear by their behavior. That being said, many people who have been around alcoholics know this, that when you try to express to them, like, hey, you getting drunk and saying this or doing that makes me feel weird or doesn't make me feel good. Usually you get shut down, avoided, ignored, corrected. So I do want to just point out that boundaries look different depending on our family structure, addictions, habits, lifestyle, culture. How do you feel about that, Abby? What about your own personal experiences kind of in the home you grew up in, and how that impacted you coming into your adulthood and establishing boundaries?
Much to your days, based on just what little you've mentioned. My father also was raging alcoholic, and neither of my parents really were ever very good at parenting skills in terms of as you said, not really able to communicate, these are my expectations, these are the consequences if they aren't met, etc. It was implied, and yeah, there was, for very long and without consistency. And so a lot of my life skills were uh, own, very much so. So I grew up, I was kind of an old soul at like 7. And that has advantages and disadvantages for sure. But one thing it has given me is a real strong desire to be very communicative with my own children, and to do a better job of saying, these are my expectations, and to be consistently communicating those things, right? Of course, I don't always nail it because it wasn't something that was shown to me. It was definitely a self-taught thing. What I don't know if you're familiar, you're a lot younger than I am, but there was a show, Third Rock from the Sun, and it's all these aliens, right, that come to the planet, and they have to learn how to human by observing other people and other families, etc. And I love that show. It's so well written, so funny, but also poignant, but relatable to me because sometimes I feel like I was born on the wrong planet and I've had to learn to human by observing. But doing that has really helped me, as I said, do what I hope is a better job of framing skill sets that you can grab a hold of, like communicating boundaries, to my kids. So yeah, I can relate to having to be self taught those things. But sometimes I think when we learn those lessons in that way, I don't know, maybe they stick a little more. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I feel like so much of the action I've taken in my adult life is literally just like from the what not to do playbook of, unfortunately, the dysfunctional household and and situations I was subject to in my youth. That being said, we've talked a lot about like signs of a boundary breakdown. Like we should also talk about healthy boundaries, and healthy boundaries are when we listen to ourself and our own opinion, and we share ourselves with others appropriately with parameters. Having healthy vulnerability with people who earn our trust, and being comfortable saying no, and also too being comfortable hearing no without taking it personally. Sometimes hearing no can be difficult, but it's not always a personal attack. And that being said, when it comes to boundaries, I really do feel like the short term discomfort of clarifying boundaries with someone else is really, really worth the long term healthy relationship that comes out of that effort. So I'm curious, Abby. I'm going to talk about some of the ways that I set boundaries, and I'm curious what your tactics are. I mean, there's only so many ways you can set a boundary. I mean, obviously, we communicate, we state what we want explicitly, and try to leave as little room as possible for the other person to confuse or misinterpret what we're saying. Verbally communicating a boundary might sound like, when we argue, I would like for you to not yell at me and instead take a break if you're feeling too heated. And I will, and I'll mention, like, because the thing is, things often escalate, and it's like we don't go from a casual conversation with someone to like a screaming match within a second. Like, usually there's this escalation of like you hear someone's tone raising, you feel your heart rate start to rise, and like these are the signs that it's like, uh-oh, like something bad is coming, and like maybe if I create this boundary, we can prevent it from getting worse. So like communicating verbally is one way, but then like action, oftentimes we're in situations where we verbally communicated our boundary, but then unfortunately it's violated for some reason. Maybe the other person has genuinely forgotten. But when our boundaries are violated, we have to reinforce it with action. And that doesn't mean like you're gonna seek revenge or you're gonna like get into a physical altercation with this person. But it's like an example for this scenario is, you know, say you told your friend, it's important to me that when we make plans, if you're going to cancel on me, you give me like a couple hours heads up notice. So, like, I can kind of adjust my plans for the day, better spend my time, stuff like that. And, like, say your friend consistently still cancels your plans at the last minute with giving you no notice. The next time it happens, the action that you would take is to let the person know, hey, I want to hang out with you, but like my schedule does not allow for like the last minute switch ups. Like, let's find another time that we can both commit to and reschedule. And like it sounds so simple, but oftentimes instead we find ourselves like holding it in, feeling resentful, getting annoyed with this friend, the relationship starts to deteriorate. We start to like harbor these feelings toward them, feel like they don't value our time. So like a lot of it does come down to like clear communication. And honestly, it's no one's job to like to ensure that your boundaries are respected other than yourself. It's your responsibility to follow through and take action when you see that your boundary is being violated, to follow up to ensure it doesn't happen again. What do you think, Abby?
You are speaking my language. That really resonates. And I think what often folks kind of fall into this is, we're all raised to be nice and polite and kind, right? And I think folks feel like I'm going to be a bad person if I state my needs or wants or my disagreement or where my line is in this situation. And they're going to think I'm a bad person, or they're going to think I'm a bitch, or they're whatever, right? And we start to build up in our own mind without even giving the other person the benefit, of responding for themselves. Our brain, as it tends to do, fills in the blanks and starts to tell stories that haven't even happened yet, or scenarios that haven't happened yet. And what we do in that moment is it's really not respecting the other person. We don't think of it that way, but it's really not respecting the other person and giving them allowance and freedom to respond in the way that is appropriate for them. And so we keep it to ourselves. And as you said, we do that and then it doesn't feel good and we harbor resentment. And really, it's being super unkind to the other person because we're walking around resenting them for something they don't even know about, right? Because you haven't given them the opportunity to correct the thing that's driving you nuts. Chances are they're so oblivious to the thing. Not always, maybe they do know, but often they're completely oblivious. And you, out of that moment of trying to be comfortable yourself in that moment, have now created this like ripple effect, right? Of yuck. And then maybe the whole relationship takes a different path or course than it might have, because now there's this rift. So yeah, I think really there's as you were speaking, there's a Brene Brown quote. I don't know if you're familiar. I feel like we have talked about Brene Brown together before. Please read every word she's ever written. She's amazing. But there's a quote that she talks about. I can't remember which book, but choosing courage over comfort. And I really try to come back to that, it takes one small step of courage to just rip the Band-Aid off and say, you know what, that doesn't work for me. Can we do it differently next time? And there are a number of ways you can do that diplomatically. And I can't imagine anyone who would say, "No, I'm not gonna," everyone's going to be receptive, if you can think of a way to communicate those needs so that, again, like you said, that resentment doesn't build up, and then it's really just comfort in the moment. It creates a long-term ripple effect, right?
Absolutely. I think sometimes the reason that we avoid setting boundaries is because I'll be honest, I have the most difficulty setting boundaries with my closest family members. It's like so easy for me to set boundaries with a stranger or someone I just met or a friend, but like my family, it's just so tough. And a part of it is because I already know their playbook in terms of how they're going to react. And it's like, so, sometimes in a perfect world, the way someone would react to your boundary is, you know, if they respect you, they'll respect the change that you're asking for. But unfortunately, what I've realized is a lot of times you'll get a negative response to creating a boundary. So sometimes the person will legit push back and be like, oh well, I don't know if I can do that. Or like sometimes the other person will test your limits, and like you'll set a boundary, but they'll push it to the limit and the edge to see how far they can how far they can get you to deviate from it. Or sometimes they'll try to rationalize it or question you or get super defensive. Or my absolute least favorite response to setting a boundary is when the other person brings up things that you've done in the past as a point of reference for what you're asking for and being like, oh, well, there was this time that you did that. And it's just like, what? Other times people react by literally ghosting you. You'll set the boundary and they'll disappear. They'll give you the silent treatment because they don't want to acknowledge what you've asked for, which is insane to me. But that being said, acceptance is the most healthy way to respond to someone setting a boundary. I mean, if you want to have a functional, healthy relationship with that person. And what I've noticed is when people respond to you setting a boundary with one of these negative reactions I just mentioned, it's usually a sign that like you're way past due setting a limit with this person. And that's probably a part of the reason why it's so tough to like kind of finally stand your ground. And a sign that you might want to consider setting a boundary is like if you're interacting with someone and you leave every single interaction with that person feeling like you have less energy, feeling drained, feeling disappointed, feeling angry, feeling like it's a one sided situation where you're just giving and they're taking. Yeah, might be a sign that it's time to not put up walls, but just create some parameters to make things a bit more comfortable. And I guess I guess what I want to talk about next is like different ways to say no. There's so many different ways that you can say no, and I guess a part of it kind of depends on what you're saying no to. But I think some of us struggle with the saying no part. And I feel like Abby, of all people, probably has some very graceful ways to say ways to say no. I'm curious, what are some of your, least harsh ways that you've set boundaries with people?
Honestly, yeah, I do try to be diplomatic. And yes, I think that there are a number of ways you can kindly say no. And I think it does come back always to protecting your own peace, right? And if you keep that at the forefront, then it can kind of guide you into you might have to be creative, but as you said, it's so dependent on the situation. It can be hard to think offhand unless I'm asked to direct, like, oh, what about this particular situation. But honestly, say being honest about, listen, I can't do that because of XYZ time constraints or whatever it might be, but here's what I can do. Or, I don't know that I'm a good fit for what you're looking for, but I think you should reach out to this person over here. They might be able to help you. Or, I'm trying to think of some other. I try to always have some backup. Like I can't do it, but here's a thought to consider. So that the person that has the ask doesn't feel like they're leaving empty-handed or with the door shut, but more of a, hey, this isn't a good fit for me at this time. But maybe let's revisit that conversation another time. So that you're not completely shutting people down, but providing some other opportunities. What are some of the thoughts you had on that? And I'll keep thinking.
I love that, and I'm totally seconding that. I feel like that is like rather than just saying no, being able to provide an alternative, like the worst thing you can do is give an explanation. And like this, as I get older, it becomes more clear to me. It's just like, girl, why are you explaining yourself to people? It's like you don't owe anyone an explanation for why your answer is no. And what I've noticed is like once you start to fall down that rabbit hole of explanation, then you kind of open the conversation up to the other person potentially trying to debunk your boundary or trying to give you an alternative for what makes you okay. So, that being said, I feel like no, but like a no, but maybe try this, or something like that doesn't work for me anymore, but this does. Kind of like opens the conversation to talk more about what it is you're actually looking for. And I think, like, as an individual, it's really important to lead your life with certain boundaries in mind. And, like, for me, the most important one is like saying just, it seems simple, but just saying no to things that I don't like or make me uncomfortable without feeling like I need to provide this long winded explanation as to why the answer is no. And then also just saying no to things that I know are not going to contribute to my growth or going to like waste time that is really valuable, or is an interaction with someone that I know is going to drain my energy. I've noticed with certain certain friends or family members or whatever the case, I've literally started like setting timers when I have phone calls with certain people because I know that like after a certain time limit, the conversation will kind of go off the rails and just turn into a nightmare. And for me, my boundary is like, okay, you have 25 minutes to get your point across to me. And if you can't do it in that time, then you're going to have to try another time.
I think that is awesome, by the way. And I think that's half the battle when we're talking about these things is really knowing yourself, really knowing what I think you have to kind of spend some time in self reflection. And for some people, that might be journaling. For some people, that might be, talking it through with a friend or a therapist. I think it's important to really have a clear idea within your own heart and mind where your personal boundaries are. I mentioned sleep earlier. I try not to mess around with that. I may once in a blue moon choose to stay up a couple hours later, but I don't really break from that routine often. And I try to just be honest with people. Look, I'm real good in the mornings, pretty good in the afternoons, but I'm not great for late night stuff. And I think knowing where you're going to be at your optimal best when to show up to anything you've committed yourself to, just knowing that I can do X, Y, and Z up until this point, and then these are the places I'll need support, assistance, whatever. Knowing what your personal boundaries are, knowing what your strengths are, and knowing yourself well enough to know if someone's asking something and your internal voice, your gut's like, if you have that hesitation at all internally, I think it's important to sit with it. And if you're just not sure, it's definitely okay to say, hey, can I get back to you on that tomorrow? Let me take a real honest look at my schedule. Let me sit with it for a moment, and consider and follow up with you tomorrow when I can give you a real honest answer. I think it's okay to practice that pause too. What do you think of that?
Way too often we just rush into, I don't know if it's like we feel like there's some pressure on us from the other person to just like respond as quickly as possible, but definitely something I've been doing lately is just taking a bit more time to sit with something before responding, especially if I feel like it's something that's triggering or testing my boundary. I mean, something else important to note is like there's a fine line between being passive, being aggressive, and then what you're looking for is what's in the middle, which is being assertive. And oftentimes, when we kind of wait until we're at our wits' end to make a boundary clear, we might end up unsuccessfully communicating that boundary because we're just so depleted at that point. And, you know, it's like passively communicating a boundary is almost as bad as not communicating it at all. When you're passive about your boundary, it's like you're fundamentally uncomfortable about letting the other person know what you need. Therefore, you think it's safer for you to just kind of keep it to yourself. And if you're passive about your boundaries, like maybe you're just forcing yourself to kind of ignore the things that are triggering you. On the other side of the spectrum, if you're aggressive about enforcing your boundaries, obviously that's not going to get anything done either, because it's like, if you're confronting or demeaning someone else to make your point, or yelling at them or calling them names or shaming them, that's not really helpful either. And then passive aggressiveness, like this combination of the two, is like basically trying to force people to guess what we need based on how we're acting, and like we're trying to avoid this confrontation, and we're hoping the other person is just going to figure out what they're doing that bothers us and just correct it on their own without us taking any direct action, which usually doesn't help. And people who are passive aggressive will usually like, they'll seem upset, but like they'll say they're okay, like they'll be moody, but they won't tell you why. Like they'll bring up old stuff. So it's like assertiveness is the key. And being assertive is about telling people how you feel honestly as a result of their behavior. And for those of us, like I said, who are recovering people pleasers, it's really hard to do that sometimes because we don't want to upset anyone or rock the boat. But assertiveness is what we're looking for to successfully communicate our boundaries.
And it's really for folks to have you guess how they feel, or say, act one way but say I'm fine, and like you said, to dig and see, well, what is it, and is it me? I mean, it opens up this whole other can of worms, because then the person's overthinking the situation, or maybe they're guessing wrong how they're supposed to react, or maybe they don't know at all because you haven't bothered to tell them. So I think it can save a whole multitude of further issues if we can all just, take the band aid off, choose that courage over comfort, and just speak our needs in the moment, and really talk to each other about providing the space, like creating a safe space for each other, coming down to that, as you said, it's a level of respect, really, to create space for each other where we can feel safe enough to say, hey, these are the things that make me uncomfortable. These are the things that I would feel more supported in. And really listen to each other, and listening to each other express those boundaries without, I think sometimes when we're feeling defensive, especially, we listen to respond, right? We pause talking enough for the other person to talk, and then we're responding without really hearing. So I think part of boundary setting in any relationship, clients or friends, or otherwise, it helps to give that space and that pause where we feel seen and heard, because isn't that at the end of the day what all of us really need and want to feel, seen and heard? It's as simple as that, but it sure can feel complicated when we get things like emotions and all that stuff in the way, right?
That is the truth, girl. I mean, I feel like a lot of us as well may have had different types of trauma throughout our life, whether it be physical abuse or emotionally abused, or, maybe you had parents who got divorced, or maybe you were bullied, or maybe you had a parent who was incarcerated, or maybe you were neglected by your parents, or maybe one of your parents passed away when you were young or got into a bad accident. I mean, these are all things that traumatize us to some degree. And it is important to note that when we experience trauma, it does impact our ability to create boundaries. And oftentimes, people who experience, especially the people who experience physical or emotional abuse, find it really, really hard to set boundaries with their abusers for obvious reasons. Something that people don't talk about a lot is emotional abuse, and I feel like emotional abuse is like, I don't not it's like the silent killer. Like, I don't know how to explain it. It's like I feel like to some extent when someone is abused or has trauma, it's like society is almost like, well, if I can't see proof of it, it didn't happen. And it's like, well, what are you talking about? It's like, having an absence of emotional attention, or like having being in an environment where you're emotionally neglected, has severe impacts on your psyche and your life. And oftentimes, those of us who are in situations that are emotionally neglectful or abusive tend to become almost enmeshed with our abuser. Typically someone in this scenario is usually a narcissist, and feels like they're more important and their thoughts and feelings are more important than the other person. um, but this enmeshment often kind of gives trauma victims the perspective that they're responsible for how other people feel, and that it's their job to like protect them from undesirable outcomes. And it is important, if you've had these experiences, to really unpack them, because I do want to remind you, it's not your job to figure things out without emotional support. It's like it's not possible as a human being. And as a child, it's not your responsibility to figure things out without parental guidance. So if you were in that situation, you didn't do anything wrong. You're not the one at fault. And something I do think is important is kids' boundaries. I feel like sometimes, as parents, we kind of belittle the boundaries of children because we think they're not intelligent or mature enough to articulate a boundary. And I don't have any children, so I'm really curious, Abby, what has your experience been like honoring the boundaries of your children?
This is a great subject, and I'm glad you brought it up. I do think it's so important to empower our children to use their own voices and to speak up about what is okay and what is not okay. And kids are shy to do it. Even something as simple as ordering for themselves at a restaurant, right? I try to encourage that so that they know how to use their voices to speak up. Things like this really was, my kids are getting older now, but especially when they were little, I would never ever say make my kids hug so and so or this person or that person. It's I want them to know they have body autonomy and a choice, and that they get to say yes or no to, a hug, a handshake, a high five from a family member or something along those lines. I think giving our kids a voice and empowering them to use it is so important, and something I keep working on. My girls are 12 and 14. Our son is 18. And the girls especially, I feel like are naturally a little more shy about ordering for them. I keep bringing it back to that, but I think that's one of those easy places to start with this skill set, right? Or whatever it might be, to please speak up, speak for yourself. You have a voice. Sometimes my young will still say, I can't do this or I can't do that. And I'll say, yes, you are. You are a strong, independent woman. You can do that, and I want to see you try. And if you try a few times and you still need help, I'm happy to help you. But I want to see you do it because I know you can. I think that empowering each other and believing in each other and boosting each other, if we are maybe not sure how to stand on those feet yet, can go a long way. So as a mom, that's something I'm working on anyway.
I love that. I bet the experience of having you as a mom is lovely. I love to hear that. I do feel like it's important to be as a mom, to be the first person in your child's life to teach them boundaries and communicating boundaries. And unfortunately, sometimes boundaries will push us to issue an ultimatum. And I feel like the word ultimatum kind of has a negative context because an ultimatum is ultimately we're telling someone either you do this or there's this consequence, period. No further context required. And I do want to mention that sometimes, while an ultimatum might feel extreme or like, your last resort, ultimatums are healthy if you're going to use them as a tool to follow through on your boundaries. And obviously, if the consequences are reasonable. So, like, a healthy ultimatum might be, if you're not ready to go by 5 o'clock, like I'm taking an Uber without you because I want to make our reservation on time. An unhealthy ultimatum might be, if you go out with your friends on Friday night, I'm not going to talk to you for 2 weeks. That's a little, or telling someone, like sometimes in relationships, I've seen people give ultimatums around when they want to have kids. Like if we don't have kids, this relationship is over within the next 3 months, or whatever the case may be. That might be a bit extreme, but an ultimatum is a good way sometimes to like provide the consequence necessary for the other person to respect your boundary. And also too, just like kind of keeping different affirming statements in your head. Like, I one that I like to repeat in my head is, in a healthy relationship, the other person will respect my wishes. And like obviously there's limits to someone respecting your wishes, and I don't mean anything unreasonable, but like honestly, it's almost the bare minimum to ask in a healthy relationship. The other thing too is like sometimes people don't respect our ultimatums, and sometimes we have to just like cut someone off or end a relationship or friendship. But I do think it's important before we go down that road to ask ourselves, have I set my boundaries? Like, have I actually tried setting boundaries with this person? Is this person genuinely aware of my grievances or issues with them? Are there other aspects of the relationship that are healthy and worth saving or holding on to? And of course, like, is the other person willing to repair the relationship by honoring the boundaries that I've yet to set? I think sometimes we'll jump to like cut someone off without setting boundaries, because we've gone so long without setting the boundaries and we're feeling so tired and distressed from the relationship. But it is important to ask yourself those questions before just cutting someone off.
I totally agree with that. And I think as you started to talk, I talked about how I've empowered my kids, right, to make their own. But same, I think when it comes to ultimatums, it tends to be with my kids, to try to let them know, hey, we don't show up late to stuff, for example, right? That's something that's always been important to me, whether it be school or whatever it is. That if you're not 10 minutes early, you're late, right? And so that's a real challenge when they were, especially when they were little, when I have three kids, and when they were, in those little bitty stages and ages of toddlers where they would fight about what they were going to wear and eat and all those things, right? We still were not late very many times going where we needed to go because just as you said, those healthy ultimatums, right? I wouldn't, be unkind to them, but I would certainly communicate what my expectations were. Here's the boundary, guys. We're not going to be late, and this train leaves the station every day at this time. And certainly there were times where I can remember picking Callista, my middle one, up by her little booty and kind of not throwing her, but tossing her a little bit out because we're leaving. And I don't care if your shoes are on or not. Here's your shoes. I'll toss them with you and your little booty out the door right there. So you can sit there while I lock the door and get us going. Right. And you know what? There weren't many more days that she didn't have her shoes on when we needed to go. Little tips and tricks like, not to get off track, but like, who's my line leader today? You start to set up some fun things so that we can all work together toward that common goal of we're not going to be late, and I want you to respect other people's time and know how important that is. So yeah, those little ultimatums, I think, in a healthy context, can be really useful, in these situations.
Absolutely. And some boundaries are common sense. It's like certain things are just like, the average person should know not to do. But I will say, for the most part, boundaries aren't always common sense, and they're things that you have to teach the other person. And because, depending on where you are geographically or culturally or your family, whatever the case may be, things are different for different people. So it's not good to just expect that someone is going to know what your boundaries are or have the same boundaries as you. It's always good to actively teach and share them. And also too, I just want to mention, like, boundaries are not just in like intimate relationships with child or parent or significant other. Like, boundaries are also really important to consider at work. So many ways boundaries can be violated at work. Obviously, obvious things like someone flirting with you, or like working and not being paid, or not being able to take the time that you need off for your life and your personal issues, doing work for others and not being recognized or valued for it. Um, Oftentimes, if you're in a toxic work environment, you'll find yourself often defending your boundaries. A toxic work environment is one that's, maybe you're working crazy long hours, like maybe there's a lot of gossip and bad vibes. Maybe you're not being paid for extra work you do, or it's like super clicky, or your boss is like really narcissistic or has been bullying you, or you've been sexually harassed. Like, these are, really toxic work. And typically the sign of a toxic work environment is one that does not have any healthy boundaries. So it's also important to remember that if you find yourself in these situations at work, you don't have to join in on the toxicity. You can also set boundaries at work, and it might be helpful to identify some healthy people in the toxic environment. It's always a good idea to like document your issues and talk to HR about it, talking to your boss, and honestly just finding support outside of work to manage your work related stress. Maybe you have to talk to your partner or a therapist. So managing boundaries at work is also super important. Before I pass the mic back over to Abby, I just want to mention we're going to be closing our space within like the next 10 minutes or so as we're coming up on the hour. I do want to give those who have been listening the opportunity to request the mic and add something to the conversation, or give us some feedback or some thoughts, now is the time. You're more than welcome. This is a safe space for you to share whatever you want to share.
It's been really great to look out and see some familiar faces and some friends who would be new to me. Really enjoy having you all as part of the conversation, even if you're not up on the speaker panel. Oh, good. The miss is coming up. We'll bring you up on the stage here. But yeah, good points about work relationships. I have to say, my business partner has been my husband for the last 17 years. I've been in the wellness industry for 23 years. And when I met him, he was working at a grocery store and delivering pizzas, and I kind of dragged him into my world, kicking and screaming. But boy, it really took off for him, and it's something he's grown to be very passionate about. But yeah, we kind of had that extra layer of not only have we been parents, but married people and business partners together, and that's it's created some interesting challenges over the years, and really having to learn how to communicate what our boundaries are in those different situations. Not for the faint of heart. How are you, Miss Wynn? Good to see you.
Hi, hi. I had to talk to two of my favorite ladies on the night or the day of a full moon. It's in Aquarius, which I am one. So, had to say hello. You guys always have just the most to me one of the the most effective ways of communicating. You two are always very clear with your what you're saying. There's no run around, and I just love when you guys team up and we seem to understand how much more we can achieve and get through to people when we combine our efforts, right? I just adore you too. And I wanted to also say thanks for having me up. I wanted to touch on what you were talking about earlier, Abby, elevate, about your kids and how you make sure that they are aware of their bodily autonomy. And I don't have kids myself, but the way I view children, particularly like very young children, Gen Alpha, is that like it's a village. We're all raising them, and if we all treat them the same way as adults, then they can start seeing a world be created um, that is kind, empathetic, thoughtful, considerate, right? So what I started to do, even as an adult with no children, is started to ask not just children but everybody if I can hug them. Abby, when you and I met in New York, one of the first things I said was, "May I hug you?" And people get kind of surprised by it, but you also see them, some of them often are relieved, right? Relieved to be asked before someone touches you. And on a personal level, I one of physical touch is not one of my love languages. I have to be really comfortable with you to want to physically touch and hug and feel kind of like, comfortable with you in my space. So if I were a child, if I could go back to my childhood, I would have so greatly appreciated any adult saying, "May I hug you, little girl?" um, and even as an adult now, I greatly appreciate if anybody asks. Granted, I don't expect it. I know that some social circumstances are just not really like there yet, but I think that the more of us kind of try to communicate this uh thoughtfulness, right? Then not only will the children be greatly affected by it, but the adults who are a little whose love languages aren't physical, right? And I noticed that like sometimes my nephew specifically, um, sometimes I'll give him a choice. "Hey, can I get a hug? Do you want a high five, or do you just want me to leave you alone right now?" And he gets to choose. And sometimes he's grateful to be like, "I'm good right now. I'm playing my game." And I don't enter his space. That's not the time to enter his space. He made it clear. And sometimes he'll go, "Yeah, I want to hug you," and he'll come hug me. So it's just a great what is that quote that we were in the space where we talked about how it's far easier to raise strong empathetic children than it is to repair broken men, right? And if we start with these kind of habits and boundaries with the children we are all raising together, then it'll just be a far kinder world that we end up in.
I think that is so beautiful. And I love that there are people out there who don't have children who are treating the whole, as you said, all of us together, we're all raising as a village children everywhere and looking out for each other. And I think that's huge. Empowering each other to make our own choices. And really, consent is everything. And especially in the post pandemic world, I think it's more important to be more sensitive because people did leave that experience traumatized. And maybe they used to be huggers and maybe they're not now, or whatever. We can't make assumptions about what your comfort level is in your body and in your space. And what a beautiful way to encourage and empower each other to express what our boundaries are when we enter in. Hey, is a hug, hug or high five or elbow or whatever, I think that's really really special. I appreciate you sharing that, Miss Wen.
Of course. And I mean, you guys are leading the pack with it. I think like between Juju and myself and you, we're like three generations of women who are just trying to uh, just make the world a little bit kinder, right? And again, I wouldn't be so presumptive as to presume, like, I'm not raising your child. That's your job. That starts at home. But I do see it as an adult in this world. It is my responsibility to show children kindness, to show children that the world is kind, and that or that it can be kind if they have seen otherwise. But it obviously, I would never impose my ideals or anything on anybody's children. It's just more, hi, I'm an adult. You're going to experience the world with adults other than your parents. And I hope that it's with adults who are considerate of your existence. You know?
Love that so much and love and appreciate you. You are literally the best. And I'm the opposite. Physical touch is totally my love language. I am literally an octopus. And so I get a little overzealous and I just pull everybody in to big squishy hugs and need to continue to work on, oh, right, not everybody digs that. So it's good to have those reminders.
Well, we are close and comfortable, so you can always hug me. But, like I said, not everybody's love language is that. And we should be mindful of what they are. And I'm sorry, you keep on miking Juju. You're the host.
I just want to say thank you for coming up and adding your wisdom to our conversation. I'm so happy to have you as a part of our space. And I am not surprised to hear that you are a big respecter of children's personal space and autonomy and boundaries. That's not a surprise to me, but I do wish there were more people like you out in the world, and didn't assume that every child wants to be hugged or kissed or grabbed, because they certainly do not. That being said, we've talked so much about like physical and emotional boundaries. Before we close this space, I have to mention material and time boundaries. You also have to be mindful of setting boundaries with your possessions. And by that, I mean, like, maybe you don't loan things to people who have shown you that they don't respect your possessions. Or maybe when you do share a material item or possession with someone else, you set expectations up front. Like, hey, I'm loaning you my car. I expect when you give it back to me, there to be the same amount of gas in it. Simple things like that. You'd be surprised when you don't make these expectations clear, the state that people will return your belongings to you in. And then also your time. Like, you have to set boundaries around your time. Like, I mentioned this a couple times, but like having long conversations with emotionally draining people is not it. Like, the timer, like setting a timer on my phone during phone calls has saved me from so many unnecessary long conversations that I just did not need to have. And also too, just in terms of like, don't I don't want to say don't do favors for people who don't reciprocate, because when you do a favor, you're doing it to do a favor. You're not necessarily doing it for it to be reciprocated. But be mindful of your time. Don't overexpend your energy and your resources and your time doing requests and things for people who would not do the same for you if you ask them to. I also want to just say quickly again, if anyone else is listening and wants to come up and add anything to the conversation before we close the space, you are more than welcome. I know we've had a few people in the room this whole duration for the whole hour. And if there's anything insightful you've learned or anything insightful you want to share with us, you are more than welcome to. This is a safe space.
I love that you brought that up about our time and our material possessions. I hadn't thought of that coming into this conversation. But I think that's so important. And we all think about things so differently, or we may be completely distracted and certain things not occur to us. So kind of looping back into things we've talked about throughout the conversation, communication is so key. So really continuing to fine tune our communication skills, and doing that in a respectful way really ties into being able to, as I said, empower others, but also empower yourself to set those clear boundaries, especially, yeah, with our time, I think is one of those big ones. So speaking of, I know we're close to or actually we're just over our hour, aren't we? Time always flies when we get together, and I love these stimulating conversations, and really appreciate all the work you've done, Sierra, to put this together. Your graphic design is amazing, and I really appreciate all your efforts in planning out these weeks. And I'm so excited for next week.
Thank you, Abby. For everyone listening, this is a weekly space. We do this space every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern. Someone recently brought it up to me that it's a bit narrow-minded to assume that everyone lives in the United States, and that I should start also posting the time for these spaces in, I think it's Universal UTC. What does it stand for? Universal Time?
Code. I think it's Universal Time Code, I think is UTC. And I tell you, I've joked with this before, but it's true. I always consider myself this strong, independent women, just like I tell my girls. But my gosh, time zones are like kryptonite. It screws me up so badly. I feel like everyone knows Eastern, but yeah, that's probably a good thing to do, is add the UTC as well. Nice thought.
I think it's 6 p.m. UTC, I believe. But for everyone who is in the United States, I'm on the East Coast and it's 2 p.m. Eastern. That being said, if you join late, this is recorded space. So once this space ends, you'll be able to play it back from the beginning. I am also working on uploading these as recordings to our YouTube so that you can access them at any point or share them. We do have the next 2 topics planned out for the rest of the month. But if there's anything specific that you want Abby and I to talk about in an upcoming space, feel free to send suggestions. Just want to thank everyone who's been listening for their time and energy. Thank you for letting down your boundary today, and hearing what we had to say and participating in our space. We appreciate that. We will be back next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern. And I'm going to close the space now. So thank you, everyone, for your time. And thank you, Abby.
Thanks so much, Sierra. Thanks to our friends, and we'll see you soon.